Women's football in England has a fantastic and rich history which deserves to be celebrated to recognise how great it once was and is now. So, let's talk about it. My name is Scar and today I'm going to be telling you everything you need to know about women's football history in England. It is important to note that women's football has fantastic roots outside of Europe, and they also deserve to be celebrated and acknowledged as well, which I plan on doing at a later date. This video, however, will be taking on a Eurocentric and English perspective of women's football. Additionally, a lot of records regarding women's football have been misplaced, not accurately recorded, or lost to time. However, there still is a lot to talk about, so let's begin. And we're going to go all the way back to the 15th century. It is probably surprising to most people, but records indicate that women were playing football as early as the 15th century. Like men, they played within their communities as a pastime, and over time, teams were formed and regular matches began to take place. There is also a reference to women playing football in the 16th century in Sir Philip Sidney's 1580 poem, A Dialogue Between Two Shepherds. Quote, "A time there is for all, my mother often says, when she with skirts tucked very high with girls at football plays." The first recorded women's match took place on the 7th of May 1881 between England and Scotland in Edinburgh. The birthplace and therefore nationalities of a lot of the players has been called into question, and it is believed that at least some of them were part of the theatre community simply acting out these roles. Then, as the 1890s unfolded, women's club football gained momentum, with local teams competing against each other in matches and also competitions. In the early days of women's football, British newspapers often ran articles or illustrations that mocked female players. Some implied that they simply cared more about their looks than the sport, whilst others implied that they were overly emotional when going in for tackles or arguments with the referees. For example, an 1894 edition of The Sketch featured illustrations of women pulling each other's hair. It also included stereotypical depictions such as the good-looking goalkeeper, and images of players fixing their hair and powdering their noses at half-time. The rise of sporting women seemed to shock and confuse the British public. In 1895, Nettie Honeyball, the founder of the British Ladies Football Club, was interviewed by a representative of the Westminster Gazette. She explained how her team was improving in skill, confidence, and how the sport was growing in popularity with audiences. The interviewer couldn't seem to grasp this and was also astonished to learn that many of the players were married. A section of this interview said, quote, "The husbands, what about them?" he asked. "What have they got to do with it?" Honeyball replied. "Why shouldn't ladies play football as well as men? I can assure you we are homely girls. We don't want any la-di-da members. We play the game in the right spirit, we allow charging but no bad temper is ever shown, and I've never heard a cross word spoken." The British Ladies Football Club held a North vs South of the Thames match on the 23rd of March 1895. Over 10,000 paying spectators packed the Crouch End Athletic Ground to watch the 60-minute game, which the North won 7-1. However, the significance went beyond the scoreline. This event drew attention to the growing women's rights movement. The BLFC's visibility paralleled with campaigns such as Votes for Women, the formation of the National Union of Women's Suffragette Societies, and Women's Political and Social Union, amplified the women's calls for emancipation, which were growing increasingly powerful and ultimately unstoppable. During World War I, women took on many jobs traditionally held by men, especially in the factories. To improve health, well-being, and boost morale and productivity, sporting activities were encouraged. Football became a popular choice, and many factories went on to form their own teams. In 1917, munitions factories established the Munitionettes Cup, with Blythe Spartans Munitionettes defeating Bulco, Vaughan and Co. 5-0 in the final. There was a growing demand for leagues and a governing body to allow women to play professionally. The most renowned and successful factory-based team of the era was Dick Kerr and Co. On Christmas Day 1917, the newly formed Dick Kerr Ladies faced against nearby Arundel Coulthard Foundry in a charity match. 10,000 spectators gathered at Deepdale to witness the beginning of an extraordinary success story in women's sports. Dick Kerr Ladies achieved their first of many remarkable victories, raising £600, the equivalent of $50,000 today, for wounded soldiers. Just 3 years later, a Boxing Day match against St Helens was watched by 53,000 spectators at Goodison. Another 14,000 people were outside the stadium trying to be let in. From 1917 to 1965, Dick Kerr Ladies played 800 matches and also produced the country's all-time leading goalscorer, Lily Parr, who is believed to have netted 900 goals over her 30-year career. During and after the war, Dick Kerr Ladies toured the country and played charity matches to raise money for injured servicemen. They can arguably be considered the first professional women's team, as players received 10 shillings to cover their expenses. By 1921, there were around 150 women's football clubs, with matches drawing in large crowds, sometimes around 45,000 spectators. The future of women's football seemed bright. However, despite its rising popularity and the revival of international matches after World War I, controversy was on the horizon. On the 5th of December 1921, the FA convened at its London headquarters and announced a ban on women's matches taking place on professional pitches or grounds of FA-affiliated clubs. They stated, quote, "The game of football is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged." This ban relegated women's football to public parks for nearly 50 years. Despite the ban, women remained determined to continue playing football, and on the 10th of December 1921, around 30 teams from across England gathered in Liverpool to establish the English Ladies Football Association. The following year marked the inaugural and only ELFA Challenge Cup competition, which saw Stoke Ladies lift the trophy after defeating Doncaster and Bentley Ladies 3-1 in the final held in June 1922. Although hindered by a lack of adequate facilities, women's football continued to persist through the 1930s, 40s, 50s and much of the 1960s. Matches were often held at rugby venues or smaller grounds which could not accommodate large crowds. Whilst the women continued to play, they increasingly found themselves overshadowed by the men's game. As societal changes unfolded in the 1960s, women increasingly advocated for their social rights. On November 1st, 1969, representatives from 44 clubs convened in London for the inaugural meeting of the Women's Football Association. Arthur Hobbs, who was a carpenter and amateur footballer, became the WFA's first honorary secretary, whilst Pat Dunn became its first chair. In 1967, Hobbs organised a women's tournament in Deal, Kent, with the support of local miners. This Deal tournament celebrated women's football and was the precursor to the Women's FA Cup, which was first held in 1971. The FA faced increasing pressure to lift the ban on women's football, and in December 1969, the FA Executive Committee recommended that what they termed ladies' football was no longer to be classified as unaffiliated. The following month, during an FA Council meeting on the 19th of January 1970, the FA voted to repeal its controversial 1921 resolution, which labelled women's football as unsuitable. 1970 was a pivotal year in women's football for another reason. It saw the first event designated as the Women's World Cup. It was held in Italy and wasn't organised by FIFA, but by an Italian consortium named the Federation of Independent European Female Football. Despite being unofficial, the tournament drew in large crowds and Denmark went on to lift the championship title. Then in 1971, the FA lifted its ban, meaning that women's matches were now permitted to take place on FA-affiliated grounds and that registered referees could officiate women's matches. Alongside official league matches, a women's club knockout competition was introduced and would later be known as the Women's FA Cup. Southampton went on to win the inaugural final in 1971 and would go on to lift the trophy 8 times in the first 11 years. That same year, UEFA recommended that the women's game be governed by national associations. On February 29, 1972, the FA announced its recognition of the WFA. In November 1972, the first official WFA England team travelled to Scotland for an international match, which saw England make a comeback to win 3-2. And, fun fact, this match took place exactly 100 years after the first recognised men's international match, which was also contested between England and Scotland. In 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act made it easier for women to train to become professional referees. The movement to integrate women's football into the heart of our national sport gained traction and was spearheaded by the WFA. In 1981, they established their own admin office, although the sport was still largely managed by dedicated volunteers. Throughout the 1970s, 80s and early 1990s, the WFA worked tirelessly to promote the women's game. At the same time, the FA began taking greater interest. In May 1984, the WFA was granted affiliation with the same status as County FA, paving the way for more centralised support from the FA. That year, England faced Sweden in a 2-legged final of the inaugural UEFA competition for women's national teams, ultimately losing 4-3 on penalties. This tournament served as a precursor for the Women's Euros. In 1989, Channel 4 started to provide regular coverage for women's football. The 1990s saw the introduction of strategic plans to aim to further develop women's football in England, along with the establishment of the first 20 centres of excellence for girls. In 1998, Hope Powell became the first full-time England women's coach, and she was later honoured with an OBE and a CBE. 2 significant milestones happened in 1991. The WFA launched a 24-club National League, which expanded the following year to 3 divisions of 10 teams: Premier, Division 1 North and Division 1 South. Additionally, FIFA introduced the Women's World Cup that same year. A significant change occurred in 1993 with the WFA voting to transfer its operations over to the FA, citing insufficient funds to continue developing the game that it had fostered. In response, the FA established a Women's Football Committee and also created a full-time position of Women's Football Coordinator. The 1993-94 season also marked the WFA Cup coming under the FA's control with 137 teams participating. The following year, the FA also took management over the WFA's National League and League Cup, resulting in the creation of the FA Women's Premier League. In 1997, the FA outlined its plans to develop the women's game from grassroots to elite level. Interest in the game was rapidly growing, with increased media attention and more participants joining in. By 2002, women and girls football had become the most popular team sport for female players in England, meeting this FA milestone 3 years ahead of schedule. In 2005, women's football received a major boost when England hosted the UEFA Women's Euros. The event set new attendance and viewership records, which was highlighted by England's 2-1 victory over Finland in front of a record-setting crowd of 29,092 at the City of Manchester Stadium. The sport's talent base was expanding, with England fielding teams across multiple age groups. The senior team, also known as the Lionesses, was beginning to make its mark internationally. The end of the decade ended on a high note as the senior team captured their first international trophy by winning the Cyprus Cup. Later that year, the Lionesses also reached the final of the 2009 UEFA Euros, but fell short to a strong German side. It wasn't until 2009 that the FA introduced central contracts, meaning that women could make a career out of the sport. As England's international teams grew in strength, club football underwent significant restructure, which resulted in the creation of the FA Women's Super League in 2011. This league began as an 8-team summer competition and replaced the FA's Women's Premier League division as the top level of women's football in England. The London 2012 Olympic Games also gave a boost to women's football as Team GB reached the quarter-finals. A standout moment for Team GB was their 1-0 win over Brazil in their third group match, which was played in front of a crowd of 70,584 at Wembley Stadium. In 2013, the FA, Sport England, the Premier League and the Football League Trust launched their joint national participation programme for girls football. In 2014, the Lionesses had played their first game at the new Wembley Stadium, drawing in a crowd of 45,619 for their game against Germany. At this stage, the senior team had become both strong contenders on the European and global stage. They claimed the bronze medal at the 2015 Women's World Cup and reached the semi-finals of the 2017 Women's Euros and the 2019 Women's World Cup. Their semi-final match against the USA attracted a record 11.7 million viewers on BBC One. Earlier that year, they also captured their first She Believes Cup victory, contributing in a steady rise in attendance at England matches, including 77,786 fans at Wembley for their game against Germany in November 2019. Barclays then went on to become the title sponsor of the FA WSL, making it what is believed to be the largest investment in women's sports in the UK. Doubling participation, expanding the fan base, and sustained international success were the three ambitious goals set out in the FA's first formal strategy for women and girls football in England, launched in March 2017. All three objectives have been met, with 1 million girls aged between 5 and 15 and 1.9 million girls aged 16 plus now actively playing football across England. A variety of FA programmes also encourage girls to engage with football from a young age, further fueling the fan base growth. Building on the success of the initial 3-year strategy, the FA introduced a new plan called Inspiring Positive Change in October 2020. Among its 8 key objectives is a standout goal to ensure equal access to football for all school-age girls, whether it be at school or through local clubs, aligning opportunities with those available to boys. A historic home win at Wembley saw the Lionesses lift the 2022 Women's Euros in front of a crowd of 87,192, solidifying women's football in the national consciousness. Media coverage and public enthusiasm for the sport has also reached unprecedented levels. Aside from the on-field triumphs, this tournament also generated 400,000 new grassroots opportunities for women and girls across England. The win was a fitting culmination of a decade worth of growth and investment in women's football. Coincidentally, it also took place during the 50th anniversary of England women's football, commemorated on the 7th of October 2022, where Jill Scott presented the original 1972 team with their long-awaited caps. In 2024, Arsenal vs Manchester United at the Emirates broke the WSL attendance record with a crowd of 60,160. And in the 2023-24 season, over 1 million people cumulatively attended a Barclays Women's Super League and Barclays Women's Championship match, with 971,977 in the top flight alone, a 41% increase from the 2022-23 season. Women's football continues to grow and thrive. Women's football in England has come so far since the FA lifted its 1921 ban, but there are still so many improvements to be made. There are plenty of amazing prospects and opportunities already on the horizon, and I cannot wait to see what the future of women's football holds. If you found this video informative and if you liked it, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button for more women's football content. And with that out of the way, I hope you all have an amazing day.